back to Immersive Sports Science. Content not commentary, sports science, not bro science. And as always, we go deep on the sports science. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about gold. Gold! In this review, we're going to be talking about Goldrush, which is a BBC 3-part documentary looking at how the Great British Olympic system developed from an underperforming system into one of the world's medal-winning countries, as well as a brief look at the sports science behind how they managed to achieve that. Goldrush, Our Race to Olympic Glory by Sebastian Grant and voiced by Ivano Jeremiah, the Humans actor, is a 3-part sports documentary looking at how Britain turned its sporting reputation around over 16 years to triumph at the 2012 Olympics. The story starts at the Atlanta Olympics, what became known as the Olympics of shame for Britain, as we only won 1 gold medal up until London 2012, and this is similar to the book it's based on, Talent Lab, although this book follows up to the Rio Olympics and, if truth be told, goes in far greater depth. Now you can see my video of it. Yes, I'm still trying to complete the series. It takes me a long time to do so because it's just so in depth. So if you want to see that, click the card above. Goldrush is a talking head documentary where it interviewed a number of the former elite athletes who'd won medals at the Olympic Games, as well as the politicians, journalists and support staff. Many of which, with the exception of the journalists, had a massive impact on the behind the scenes of getting the Olympics to the UK. Most Olympic sport is amateur, but the provision of it is far from it. It's more professional in its structure. Problem is, with the British Olympic Association from 1996 up to 1996, was the fact that many of these sports still had this concept of the plucky-go-lucky, volunteer amateur nature of that sport. The problem is, it doesn't provide medals. Most Olympians leading up into Atlanta 1996 were very much amateur in their approaches to their sports. They were builders, they were office clerks, they were maids, they were whatever during the day.
The amateur days of an athlete were very, very difficult. You were working 9 till 5, then going in the evenings and trying to train. They were 12-hour shifts. It's the dream that keeps you going.
Rise the sky, straight over the top of this road, up to the top, lean back on the rope, feet either side.
Back then, I was a full-time soldier and essentially a part-time athlete.
And then that evening, or during the early mornings, they were an athlete by second part nature. An athlete was almost like their second job, and it had to be a job in order to be able to perform at the best and the most elite. The problem is the British Association needed to get rid of this amateur nature, and that required funding from somewhere. It had to be able to make sure that their athletes could survive, and could survive so on a more professional basis, even if they are so-called amateurs. But this is not the first time that the British Olympic system went under reforms. The British sports system went under reforms after the 1912 Olympics, after a poor performance. This was in the era when it was thought that training and eating a special diet full of carbohydrates was seen as too performance enhancing and unnatural. A special Olympic bond was set up to help raise funds for athletes. This later led on to government funding of sports.
This competition told its own story. Way down below the likes of Kazakhstan and Belarus is the British team.
At the Atlanta Olympics, Britain only won 15 medals, including 1 gold. It was clear to see that what was needed was radical rethink and change in the provision and management of sport. A radical, transactional and transformative change of Olympic sport in the UK. The Olympic superpowers have been professionalising and fully funding their athletes for a number of decades, and it had come into fruition throughout the 80s and the 90s. They had the best coaches, the best sports scientists, and also the most up-to-date in sports science provisions, whereas the UK didn't really have any of that. All they had was volunteer coaches who did whatever they could with what little knowledge they had. What was also needed was better quality of facilities and training environments that would better suit an elite athlete and help to develop an elite atmosphere. Present facilities were getting old, run down and not readily available to the non-elite athlete and grassroots athletes. In other words, it has the benefit of
full array of that entire sport.
I had two principal concerns that I thought we might achieve with better funding. One was much better funding for elite athletes so that we could win. Our country likes to win. The second was to provide the resources for grassroots sport, because it is out of grassroots sport that elite sport appears. I believe that sport has a central place in our national heritage. I intend to cherish that central place and build it up for the pride that this country has when it produces the best in sport, in whatever discipline it may be. Money is the root of all progress, but when the progress is achieved, it's only been done because of the dedication of the athletes.
Not only did we underperform in Atlanta, we were underperforming as a nation in GDP and head of population. Generally, the more money you have and the higher population you have, the more chances you are of winning gold medals.
With pressure being felt by athletes to produce more bang for their buck, government sights were also set on winning the biggest sporting prize of them all.
So in 1997, we set about exploring whether London could host a future Olympic Games.
Over £28 million was pumped into the proposal.
That nothing would move sport higher or more quickly up both the political and, most importantly, social agendas as staging the Olympic Games.
Big thing, the Olympics had become the prize for a country to get. When we were launching the bid, I felt it was about the investment in sport, the use of the Olympics to accelerate the position of sport within society. The strength of your commitment would impact the strength of your bid.
Now, Britain, for whatever reason, didn't produce enough Olympic champions or enough Olympic medalists based upon their size of population and GDP, due to a whole host of reasons, that not excluding the demographics and culture of the United Kingdom and the way it develops and wants their athletes to push on into that sport rather than looking at other areas that may interest them more, as well as a drinking culture that happens around the young people at a very young age, as well as education and, of course, the actual funding the athletes needed to be able to perform professionally.
My father used to say when I asked him about the government taking tax, gosh, I hope they spend it well. And here I was with some of that money. And, you know, if we are to spend this well, this cannot just be about funding everybody. It has to be focused on the athletes that can achieve success. Some of those sports were not ready for that world-class moment. So it was tough. It didn't make me particularly popular at the time, but if you were in business anywhere else, you'd look at your business and you'd say, where am I going to get the greatest return? That's where you would invest.
This was not a very popular way of funding because it neglected sports that were on the rise, like basketball and handball. And of course, if you don't get funding, then they don't develop further. Yet again, if you spread your funding wide, you then end up missing out on athletes. Fund and specialise and focus on the athletes giving you, or chances of giving you medals. Therefore, you have a greater possibility of getting those. Of course, if you end up funding athletes, especially young athletes who are at a similar level, and they don't get particularly the funding they need, then you end up risking losing that athlete or potentially choosing the wrong athlete, therefore not potentially getting any return. What the show didn't mention is that this system is based upon the Australian high performance system, as many of those in the Australian high performance system were then inducted into the UK sport and the BOA. Their systems were also based on the more ethical parts of the East German and the old Romanian system. It's not just enough to copy and fund athletes and different systems. You also need a certain amount of talent identification to make sure you actually have the athletes there ready at an elite level who are also funded. Talent identification is highly important for an athlete's success, and the BOA now spend loads on trying to find athletes who aren't necessarily the best in their sport but may be good at other sports and don't know it. The Olympics itself can be highly inspirational for people to perform, people wanting to do exercise. And that is great in itself, but it can also inspire the next generation, for them to become Olympic athletes, to want to do the training, because that will inspire them to do seeing athletes' success, who they can relate to. But only a 1 to 2% can actually make it as an Olympic athlete. And that, to put it simply, sometimes in sport some people simply don't make the cut. For instance, people like me. What are you looking at me for? Seriously, guys. Seriously, stop it. Stop it now. Stop looking at me. What is that?
it is elite. And your chances of actually making it in elite sport is highly slim. Most people who do well at elite sport or seem to do it on a more professional basis, even if they're not professional, they do it full time. And in order to become an elite athlete, you have to sacrifice quite a lot of things in your early life. A lot of things that many of your friends are able to do that maybe you can't. Those sacrifices are going to be different for each athlete. Some people will have to sacrifice more than others. But all families and all athletes have to make a sacrifice. In order to be the best they can possibly be, you have to live, breathe, eat and sleep your sport. On top of that, there is absolutely zero guarantees of success. Truth be told, only 1 to 2% of athletes will ever make it to an elite level in their sport, and even fewer still will make it to the Olympics. And this is the success paradox. We promote this message of be reaching the elites of sports, doing the best you can, overcoming one's disability. But in reality, only few people will ever reach this superhuman stage. Many will fall down in the background, be left behind, and their decisions or the decisions made by others will ultimately affect that. Some of it's because they can't necessarily make it, they're just simply not good enough. There are other multiple reasons why. Weren't seen as good enough at a younger age and therefore dropped out before they reached their peak. Could be that because they just decided they didn't want to do it, etc, etc. There's a whole host of reasons, and sometimes these all add up, and these minute choices can lead to unexpected consequences down the line. A multiple of choices can lead to unexpected consequences, and sometimes it's literally luck. Well, luck and hard work that gets you to the top. And the people who reach the top, yes, they will perceive it as being their hard work, skill, or whatever, but it's the people around them and the systems around them and the systems they put in place, plus the determination, as well as luck, that will dictate whether they will actually make it or not. Their choices will have a huge impact. And sometimes it's not the most obvious choices that will indicate whether they will actually make it to be an Olympian.
Just speaking as a fat slob, the whole business seems ridiculous. You can't prove any correlation between the amount of money pumped in, like they used to pump steroids in Eastern Europe. You can't prove that putting another few million quid will produce more medals. There's no correlation.
What you can do is evidence quite clearly what the actual bottom line cost is of doing this thing. Travelling the world, the amount of training necessary, those have, to be blunt, fixed costs, which we either choose to engage in and then pay or not.
So the Chariots of Fire days are
they are over.
Done and gone. Every advanced country is pumping in money like this.
Absolutely.
There was also a brief mention about the funding for the Paralympic team as well, and the challenges they face from taking what is seen as, oh, look at they're brave, this kind of niche sport that's not elite because they're not as fast as ever because they're disabled, to a sport that's actually seen as being credible.
It's the boogie on 2 turntables. Thank you for letting us be ourselves. So don't mind me if I repeat myself.
And the change from that perception to meeting the superhumans as Channel 4 had coined it. What they didn't mention is the new perception as shown by some of the literature, especially the Leeds Beckett literature. They looked at the ideas of the super cripple. You're this superhuman or you're just a benefits cheat.
It's interesting now when we look back, everyone talks about Atlanta being awful, and there are lots of it that were, but actually the Paralympic team did all right for medals, but nobody really remembers that. It felt like the Paralympics were an afterthought. There were days in the stadium where you could literally name the crowd. You could identify who was related to which athlete. We just felt that nobody was really interested.
After being spotted, 11-year-old Ellie was offered a place to train at a high-performance centre 200 miles from her home in the West Midlands.
Yeah, we decided me and my mum would move to Swansea, like Sunday night to Saturday morning, to go to a high-performance centre to train, and then we would come back home to my family on the weekend. And also I had to move to a new school, but I think there was something that clicked with me that I was like, I want to do really well. And I think as a kid, you're not really thinking about the family situation, you're not thinking about like the sacrifices, like being away from my dad. I missed growing up with family and all that. Yeah, it was hard, but sometimes you have to make those sacrifices.
All athletes have to make sacrifices, and some more so than others, if they want to be the best athletes. Sometimes this can be misinterpreted or exploited, as we have seen in gymnastics, in the sense of this culture of bullying and harassment in order to try and achieve this best, because it gets results apparently. But it doesn't do the athlete any good mentally or physically.
in 2005, and they had meetings with all the kind of up-and-coming gymnasts, and they were saying, what are your goals in the sport? And I remember saying, I want to be an Olympic gold medalist. Take China, for example. Their parents drop their kids off at 4 years old, and it's basically a boarding school for gymnastics. And I'm not saying that that's right, I'm just saying that we have to find a way where we can compete against those nations. So I think a lot of pressure got put on coaches.
For us, no compromise was not compromising on any element of performance to help the athlete achieve their dream. That coaches misinterpreted it and started to think any behaviours, any training regimes were acceptable in order to get the medal. That was never what no compromise was meant to be.
You do see other coaches with a very different strategy. Sometimes those kind of brute force techniques crept its way into the system because, one, it was probably more allowed back then. Two, it was proven to have results. And there's always a fine line between, you know, being a strong, stern coach and then pushing the boundaries of what is and what isn't allowed.
A kind of pressure that was placed on athletes and coaches and governing bodies normalised a culture of bullying in some cases, intimidation, intolerance of failure.
At what point are you pushing too much? And clearly in gymnastics, the pushing went too far.
The impact of funding will be diluted if too many athletes are supported.
Right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee, where today we're looking at UK sport, supporting elite athletes. What's in it really for the general public, apart from prestige, winning medals? Why aren't we spending more of this money on the local swimming pool, for instance?
Well, I would say, why did between 5 and 9 million people watch Kelly Holmes win a gold medal? I mean, it really does have a huge impact on people in this country, motivating them to participate in sport, and we like winners.
The show could have ended up being a glorified YouTube video with the amount of B-roll used not really matching what is actually shown by the documentary, but this was not the case. The interviews looked classy and were different, the background blurred with the use of shallow depth of field, highlighting to the audience what the role is of their expertise live. The narration from the human actor fitted well, but at times was a wee bit over the top.
The London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games were a triumph for our nation.
Athletes so that we could win. Our country likes to win.
Rather than a fawn over the athletes and their success, it detailed how Team GB were underdogs from Atlanta in 1996 and the intense self-inspection afterwards. And quite rightly so, because we were crap. There was an over-reliance on journalists as key experts, rather than the key sports staff who could provide a more first-hand account, and also a further in-depth into the workings of Team GB. However, the journalists did offer key insights when required. They probably wouldn't be able to do this as well as the sports staff who were actually there. Let's not beat around the bush. Goldrush appeals to a British people's patriotism of those who are patriotic or nationalistic. I mean, just read the show's blurb. Those who are not British, and well, their perception of these events may be different, and you could argue there is a possible storytelling bias due to the language and tone used.
The London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games were a triumph for our nation.
Those kind of people may not have the same interest. Another limitation is that they did not continue their story to the Rio Games, like the book that the show is based on. It gave a false perception that the London Olympics was the end of the story, where in fact it was only part of the legacy story of Atlanta. And the changes in the BOA system, as we were one of the few countries where we did better in the Summer Olympics after we held an Olympics. Now this might have been deliberate, as it may have taken away from the story that the documentary makers were trying to make and tell. Or it could have been because they would have needed to make another episode and did not have the airtime to make one. The polished documentary kept up pacing well and avoided the trap of becoming a sports nerd groin strain, and instead was rather fascinating insight, if a pointed view from a certain depth into the British Olympic Association, the BOA, and organising committee, which had athlete interviews to humanise and keep it from becoming said groin strain. For me personally, I would have loved it if they went into fuller depth, like the book it was based on, Talent Hub. However, time is an important factor in making these documentaries. Just because it did not have the full depth does not mean it did not have depth at all, nor the fact that it met the needs and wants for the viewer, that being the casual audience, or an audience of individuals who are sports mad but not necessarily clued up on the ins and outs
of sports science. All in all, I give Goldrush a 91.36.
The big kicker started gritting his teeth now. Fernando! Hang on!
I can just hear the crowd going ballistic.
The arms have got to pump, the knees have got to come up high. He's got to find something extra. He's got to kick hard. Come on, Mo Farah!
And I remember going, I can't hear my feet, but just keep going.